the joy of geopolitics is if you study it enough, you can start predicting the future a bit. So let's touch upon those topics as well. I don't even know where to begin this particular podcast, sir. So maybe let's just do a very quick kind of storytelling recap of what happened in the Russia-Ukraine war. What do you think Putin's state of mind is now? What do you think is the future of that situation?
Right. So we had the last discussion just before the war happened. And on February 24, Russia invaded Ukraine. And everybody expected that they would steamroll Ukraine, wipe it out, flatten it. But nothing of the sort happened. They went in very systematically, very deliberately. Their vehicles were even obeying the traffic signals and all. So they were doing it in a very systematic way. They did not destroy any communication lines, any power lines, nothing like that. And it looks like they had a very clear plan of exactly what they wanted and what they did not want. So they had marched all the way up to the capital city, Kiev, and actually encircled it. And eventually they retreated from there. So it looks like it was a chess move meant to deceive the opponent as to what the real intentions are. So as of today, it's been, today is the end of May, more or less. What's happened, what the situation on the ground right now is such that they have captured at least 1/4 of Ukraine. It is now under Russian control. It is an area of land larger than Bangladesh, larger than Nepal. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, and 1/4 of that has been taken over by Russia. The eastern part of Ukraine and the southern part of Ukraine, more or less the coastal regions. So it looks like now that the objective was to cut off the entire coast of Ukraine, the Black Sea coast, and the eastern part, which is the Donbas region. Donbas. That seems to have been the objective of the Russian advance. Now, what is Mr. Putin thinking? What is Mr. Zelensky thinking? Zelensky is essentially nothing but a puppet. He is a puppet of NATO, of the West. NATO wanted to expand into Ukraine, and it looks like they were trying to provoke some kind of reaction from Russia, which would enable them to impose sanctions and essentially try to cripple the Russian economy, which has not kind of worked. Because if you see the strength of the Russian ruble on February 23, one day before the war, and if you see it today the Russian ruble is stronger. It is at a better position. So the Russians have been able to not only stop the bleeding, but reverse it and make their currency stronger because they have the trump card, they have the aces, the oil and gas supplies to Europe. The whole of Europe is essentially dependent on Russian gas. And the Russians have said, you want to buy our gas, you have to pay in rubles, which means there's a demand for the currency, which means its price goes up.
Wow.
So that's what they've done. So that
was definitely an angle for even starting the conflict in the first place. One of the angles?
I think it is something they had foreseen.
Okay.
I think this war, this invasion has been in the planning for at least 5 to 10 years. Because we know what happened in 2014 when the Russians annexed the Crimean Peninsula. So all of that, I think, was a long-term game plan. It is territory that was traditionally Russian territory. If you see the history, it's always been that way. And because of the circumstances that led to the disintegration of the USSR, all of these territories were taken away from Russia. So now they are taking it back. So it looks like they want to take out 1/4 of Ukraine, eastern region, and the entire coastal region up to Odessa in slightly towards the west. So that seems to be the game plan. They are also coordinating with China because China and the US have this big friction. So the Chinese and the Russians are coordinating. So right now we are witnessing a certain kind of dance between Russia, China, and NATO. NATO is a stand-in for the US. One thing people don't realize is that the largest power in Europe, apart from Russia, is the US. It's not Germany, it's not France. These are all subsidiary states of the US. The US is what drives NATO and the EU. So none of the countries in Western Europe has an independent foreign policy except for France. And there's a lot of friction between France and the US.
Okay.
So there's all of this dynamics at play right now. And so that's where we are vis-a-vis the Ukraine situation.
What is the friction between France and the US?
Well, the US, see, it's like this. At the end of World War II, the US and the USSR were the victorious powers in Europe. Most of the fighting was done by the USSR and most of the bleeding was done by the USSR. But the Americans, and as soon as the World War II got over, there was this Cold War that came into place because the US realized that Russia is very powerful and they wanted to dominate Europe. So then that's where the Iron Curtain came into place. and Europe was split into two branches. One was the Eastern Bloc, which is the USSR bloc, and the rest was the American bloc. Now, the Americans have a permanent military presence in several European countries. Germany has been under permanent US occupation since 1945. People don't realize it. So Germany is not truly a free country. It's a country under foreign occupation. And similarly, and the UK also is a US vassal state, more or less. It's only France that has maintained some kind of strategic autonomy over the years because of the policies they pursued.
Okay, a little hard-hitting question. Is this economic imperialism?
It is geopolitical, geo-economic, geostrategic imperialism.
Okay.
The US, we consider it to be a superpower. That's the nice term to use. It's actually an empire.
Yeah, 100%.
Superpower is a euphemism for empire. Let's understand what really happened. In the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the UK was the British Empire, which encompassed much of the globe. Now, in the 1920s, 30s, etc., the UK was waning. The British Empire was declining. It was in gradual decline. And after World War II, what happened is that the empire continued, but the headquarters moved westwards from London, UK to Washington, DC. It's the Anglo-Saxon Empire. It's the same entity. All of the structures are still in place, but now it's dominated from Washington, DC. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Freemasons thing?
Yes, of course.
Would you like to enlighten the listeners who are just curious about this whole Illuminati angle and Freemasons?
Right. So the Freemasons are supposed to be, they are known to be a secret society of sorts. Yeah. They're not very secret nowadays, but there is some aspect of the Freemasons that is like open to all. Like there are these Freemason lodges or chapters in various countries in the world, including in India.
Okay.
Many prominent Indians were Freemasons. They were members of the Freemason society.
Supposedly like?
Rudyard Kipling. Kipling was one. He was obviously British born, but British. Swami Vivekananda.
Really?
Absolutely. You look at the website of the Freemasons, the Indian chapter, and you will see the pictures of all the prominent Indian Freemasons. One was Swami Vivekananda. One was Motilal Nehru. And J.R.D. Tata, most likely.
Right.
So several prominent Indians of the past have been members of the Freemason society.
Maybe the long-term objective is just to survive and continuously
perhaps to survive,
hoard power.
Perhaps to survive, perhaps to rule the world, perhaps to rule the world from behind the scenes without drawing attention to where the real power lies. Perhaps to distract the world into believing the power lies in X place, but it actually lies in Y place.
That's what so-called powerful societies like the Freemasons can do over 100 or 200-year time period.
Quite possible. They can, if you have a secret society that is very powerful, you can orchestrate world events from behind the scenes and then blame somebody else for it. It's quite possible.
And psychologically affect an entire generation.
Yes, it can destroy entire societies and deracinate them, brainwash them, make them see themselves as very inferior. That sort of thing has been seen over and over again.
Yeah. But if you had to guess where and who the modern day Freemasons are, what would be your guess?
I would imagine it could be possibly somewhere in Europe or America, maybe split across both the continents. It's actually just one entity. And if you're really rich and really powerful, borders don't mean anything. You can go and reside anywhere in the world.
Behind the scenes, what do you think the objectives of NATO are?
The objective of NATO is very simple: to maintain and prolong American hegemony in Western Europe and hopefully all across the world.
What is the meaning of hegemony?
Hegemony means overwhelming superiority of all kinds, economic, military, etc. Power. So that's what it is. That's why we call the US a superpower, because essentially it has the ability to intervene anywhere in the world at 30 minutes notice, either militarily or economically. Its currency is the global reserve currency, the US dollar, which means it can cut any country off at a moment's notice from the global financial system and so on. So it has overwhelming economic power and overwhelming military power.
If you want your news, get it from 3-4 different angles in terms of watch right-wing news, watch left-wing news, watch centrist news, listen to podcasts, hear perspectives of YouTubers, and then form your own opinion at the end of the day.
Yes.
For example, we were talking about Succession outside. And even in Succession, I think in season 2, there is a dialogue where someone says that, no, I get my news from a comedian's podcast. And they were hinting at Joe Rogan.
Okay.
Very obviously. He's the only comedian with a mainstream podcast. And the other character reacts like, in a bad way that, oh, okay, then I don't take you seriously. So maybe the Freemasons are working through mainstream media and fictional shows like Succession to drive the narrative against the people who are speaking the truth.
It is possible. Media is extraordinarily powerful. It is what helps whoever is in power control the thoughts, feelings, and ideas and emotions of people, and the perceptions and the worldview of people. So if you control the media, you can make people believe whatever you want them to believe.
Which is why Zelensky's image was whitewashed this much, according to you?
Well, Zelensky is an interesting individual. He is of Jewish origin. He is the president of a country where Nazis have free run, neo-Nazis. I mean, the Ukraine has a Nazi history.
Give some backstory also.
Well, if you look at the various atrocities that took place against Jews in that part of the world during World War II, there was a lot of it coming from the grassroots in Ukraine. The people and the political leaders. There was this guy called Stefan Bandera, who was a very virulent Nazi. Today, he's one of the national heroes in Ukraine. And even today, you have this Azov regiment, the Azov regiment, which is essentially a neo-Nazi regiment. They have these Nazi tattoos and all that. And they are fighting, they are involved in the conflict. The Russians want to destroy them. And this guy Zelensky, he's a Jew and he is supporting Nazis who massacred his own people. In his address to the Greek parliament, Zelensky brought with him a neo-Nazi, a member of the Azov brigade, I believe. So that's the situation there in Ukraine. It's so strange that a Jewish person would actually promote Nazi people. But that's how it is. Putin is real. We know his dark side. We know he's a dictator. We know he's authoritarian. We know everything about him. It's been discussed ad nauseum in the media. Zelensky, they have created this brand. There's this brand building exercise going on right now. Zelensky.
That he stood in the middle of Kiev. He escaped Russian. There's so many stories.
Yes.
I like the story about the Russian fighter jet. You know, they call it Russian. The
ghost of
Ukrainian fighter jet.
Yeah. It turned out to be fake news.
That's what. There's so much branding. There's so much storytelling happening from the Ukrainian side. What about the Russian side?
It's been blanked out. It's been blanked out totally.
Except in Russia, where it's whitewashed for them.
Well, they have to put something out. But what's happened is that on social media, which is all controlled in the US, all these Russian channels and Russian handles have been banned. So there's only one narrative being spread right now. So that's what we're watching. It's a disinformation or brand building in real time.
Zelensky is now synonymous with Ukraine. When you think of Zelensky, you'll think of Ukraine.
Yes.
If Zelensky is a hero as a brand, Ukraine becomes the hero brand and Russia becomes the obvious villain. The world can't understand grey. They can only understand villains and heroes.
Yes.
So you're painting Ukraine as a hero, an underdog hero, and the coach in the Ukraine corner is Big Daddy USA.
Yes.
So you're trying to project USA as the big protector, etc.
Right now, what we are witnessing is that the world is now beginning to see through all the lies and disinformation. The US has been orchestrating coups all across the world. All of that has come out in black and white now. The entire list is available on social media anytime you like, anytime you want to see. There is this conflict going on in Yemen that they are engineering, and so much else going on. They talk about a rules-based world order. They flout the rules anytime they feel like. So now people are beginning to see the hypocrisy and the lies. And what the Americans are trying to do is they are trying to position themselves as the good guys, as always, and the Russians are the bad guys. And Zelensky is this Che Guevara-like figure, right? They are trying to position him in that sort of manner. So that's what they're doing. And it's very easy to sway people's opinions. When you have an underdog who is under siege and who is standing bravely, people want to root for the underdog. It's always that way.
Psychological.
Yeah, psychologically.
David and Goliath.
That sort of thing, yes.
Wow. Little quick anecdote on Che Guevara. I mean, for people who have never heard of it.
So Che Guevara was this Marxist guerrilla who fought in Cuba, who fought in South America. He fought on the side of Fidel Castro, who became the authoritarian leader of Cuba, who ruled for many decades when Cuba was under US sanctions. It still is, actually. And we see him, the world sees him as a great rebel and a great freedom fighter, but he had a very dark side. He took part in massacres and summary executions of people and all that. He was a very cruel person. Eventually, he went down south to Latin America and he tried to foment other Marxist revolutions over there. Eventually, he was hunted down and executed by certain forces that were allied with the US. But we see him as the guy in the poster. The guy with the wild hair, the motorcycle diaries, and that very famous poster that we have everywhere of Che Guevara. It's on t-shirts, it's on walls everywhere. So people remember iconic images, and that's what they've created out of him.
what's the neutral perspective on what America is doing all over the world in terms of the geopolitics that you have learned? And I know that you don't even get your geopolitics from, say, a BBC, a CNN. You get it from like a wider perspective. Yes. So what's the neutral opinion on what America has been doing behind the scenes? In terms of, America is responsible for a lot of atrocities all over the world. Let's highlight that.
Well, if you want to talk about atrocities, we can think about Dresden in World War II. There is this German city called Dresden. It was firebombed by the Americans. I don't know how many thousands of tons of bombs were dropped in one night. The entire city was burned down. Tens of thousands of people were burned alive. There was no need for that. They talk about not harming civilians. What about this? Then let's talk about Vietnam. The amount of mines they've dropped, the amount of bombs they dropped over there on Vietnam, the biological and chemical weapons they dropped there, Agent Orange to defoliate the forest. It causes birth defects even today in Vietnam. And the various massacres they carried out, My Lai massacre. I mean, they shot about 300-400 people to death in a village, unarmed men, women, children, that sort of thing. That is just the tip of the iceberg. So they have done all these things. The highway of death in Iraq, the Iraqi soldiers were retreating. They were not doing anything. They were not fighting, and they were all mowed down from the air. I mean, there is this whole list, this whole litany of atrocities they've done. But one could argue that they are simply trying to preserve their hegemony, their superpower status, their empire status, which is something every empire done it. But yes, they have been doing this. They have been engineering coups. They don't really believe in democracy. They have been engineering undemocratic coups everywhere. And they occupy many countries even today. Japan, for instance, is under US military occupation since 1945. It's permanent military occupation. Japan is a country under foreign military occupation. It's not a democratic country. The Constitution of Japan was written by the Americans. It has not been amended once since 1945. The South Koreans, their country is under US occupation since the 1950s, permanent US occupation, dozens of US military bases over there. The logic, the rationale is that we are offering you protection against the evil North Koreans. And the rationale for Japan is that we are offering you protection against China. But there are dozens and dozens of US military bases, which I'm sure the Japanese don't want. They have been protesting against that in Okinawa and other places. Shinzo Abe, for instance, he was one Japanese prime minister who wanted an independent foreign policy. He was talking about revising the constitution. Suddenly he resigns. He says, my health is not good, and so on and so forth. So that's what they've been doing.
I also want to highlight one thing. Now, this is where you actually get to know the power of America.
Yes.
It's a powerful entity,
yes.
USA. And wherever power resides, money gets attracted to those places. South Korea, extremely rich. Japan, extremely rich. Germany, extremely rich. Could this be a reason?
Well, Japan is an interesting case. In the 1980s, Japan was one of the powerful economies. It was the number 2 economy in the world in the 1980s. It was projected to eventually surpass the United States. I mean, the Japanese business policies and models were copied and studied all across the world. They were a real business and economic superpower. They were a vibrant economy and a very confident nation.
Yeah, it's a very interesting case. They combined samurai mentalities with business to make more efficient systems and to make teams work better. It's called, I think, Japanese economic boom. Post-World War Japanese economic boom. Very interesting case.
Very interesting. And then suddenly something happened. All of a sudden, it's like somebody switched off a faucet, a tap, and the economy went into a recession overnight, which it has still not recovered from. Today, Japan is a decaying country. It's a beautiful country with a beautiful culture, one of the most technologically advanced society in the world, and still very traditional. But it's an aging population. The fertility rate has dropped below replacement levels. There is this phenomenon of hikikimori or something it's called, where youngsters, they stay forever in their parents' basement. They don't go out. They don't interact with the world. And there's a lot of suicides over there. Elderly people dying alone. This society is crumbling and decaying. What happened overnight? They were surging ahead, and all of a sudden something went wrong. I wonder what went wrong. Something behind the scenes happened, and the whole economy was ruined. That's what happened. I mean, who's really running Japan? It's the US. It's the US that is really ruling Japan or running Japan. Recently, some Japanese politician actually said that, and then it was censored. That nothing happens in Japan without US approval. If any important policy decision is made, there are US generals who are sitting there overseeing that. And that's how it is. And similarly for South Korea. South Korea, again, It is a prosperous country, one of the highest GDP per capita numbers in the world. And you can see, though, that their society is being re-engineered. I have nothing against any specific religion, but you have a certain Western religion that is taking over the country. So there are a lot of people who are atheists and a lot of people who are increasingly becoming Christians. And that is something the Americans have been engineering since the 1950s. They sent, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of missionaries to South Korea. Similarly with Japan.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, you should know. I mean, that's the hidden reality of the world. If you look below the surface, you find all of this coming out.
What's happening in Saudi Arabia?
Nowadays, there is liberalization happening because the Americans want that. So nowadays, women don't have to wear whatever they used to wear earlier. They can drive, they can leave their hair open and all. So there is some change happening in Saudi Arabia, most likely at the behest of the US. But Yemen has been disastrously plundered right now. It's being bombed every day. So there is this famine-like situation, starvation happening there. There are no supplies, no medicines, daily bombardment from Saudi Arabia. So that's what's happening. It's a humanitarian crisis, but nobody cares because nobody reports what's happening there.
I think to understand the Russia-Ukraine situation much better, you have to understand who the enemies of the US are. And people's focus is on Russia and Ukraine, but there is sort of this world war happening already.
It's a Cold War 2.0, you could say, which is happening right now. Right now, it's not really hot, but the pieces are moving into position for possibly a new war. And if a new war happens, a real war involving the US, it would most likely happen in the Indo-Pacific region.
You know, when some motherfucker in a bar tells me this, I don't get scared. When you tell me this, I get a little scared.
No, it is scary. It is scary. Because if a war happens in the Indo-Pacific, it's the Indo-Pacific. India will be involved in that. Whether we like it or not, we will be pulled into that.
In a hot war.
In a hot war.
Both you and me don't follow national politics intentionally. We just spoke about it.
Yeah.
Very quickly, sir, explain why you don't follow national politics and why do you instead follow geopolitics?
See, there's politics at all levels in the world. In your family, there is politics. In your building, apartment complex, there is politics. At the municipal level, at the district level, at the state level, at the national level, you have politics at various scales. I am not interested in petty politics. It just doesn't interest me. I am interested in the competition for the biggest prize in the world, which is geopolitics and geostrategy. That is what interests me. I'm a big picture guy. That's what I've always been. So that's what I look for. That's what excites me and interests me. These local elections and politics and all that really doesn't hold much water for me.
Yeah. Again, for me, the reason is just interest. I've never been interested in national politics. The moment I had my first geopolitical conversation, coincidentally with you, I was like, okay, this is my new subject. What's your opinion on how the world looks at Modi and India right now?
So ever since Mr. Modi came to power, the perception of India very rapidly changed. But for the first time in living memory, we have a no-nonsense leader who upholds the national interest. Went all around the world. He met various world leaders. He met Trump. He met Barack Obama before that. He re-established good relations with Israel. He established a very warm rapport with Shinzo Abe of Japan. And he went and wooed all of India's potential allies. And he established very good relations with the Gulf countries. I mean, we have this cultural disconnect with the Gulf, very different religions. And yet there is so much warmth and strong strength of relationships between us and the Gulf countries today. So he did all that in the first term. Today, what we are witnessing is Mr. Modi is not traveling much. Today, right now, it's Dr. Jaishankar who is traveling all across the world, relentlessly building bridges and furthering India's national interest. And India's foreign service, the IFS, nowadays it's become very confident. They have a very clear direction of what to do. Earlier, India's diplomats and ambassadors did not have a clear idea of what our national interest is, what the policy is, what does the government want to pursue as a big picture thing. Today is very clear. Everybody knows their role. Everybody knows what to do. So that's what we're doing. Our economic policies, what the government implemented in the past 7 or so years, they are now bearing fruit. We are seeing unicorns born every week. In the coming years, you will have a unicorn being born almost every day in India. The entire infrastructure is being upgraded. The airports, the nuclear situation is also good. We are, like you said, we are building new weapons, developing new weapons, modernizing the military. So there's this whole overhaul of the country that's happening. We are also looking into the energy reserves, strategic energy reserves. That's why we have good relations with the Gulf and so on. Because of this, India has now become a genuine world power. It's not one of the top two world powers, but it is one of the 3 or 4 global poles. So today, what we are seeing is a multipolar world. A multipolar world is when we don't have only one superpower, 2 superpowers, but 3 or 4 major powers. So the 2 main powers are the US and China. They would both like to see a bipolar world where they only matter, nobody else matters. But as long as India exists and Russia exists and possibly France exists, we're going to have a multipolar world. France. Most people don't realize this, but France is a major Indo-Pacific naval power. It has multiple assets, territorial assets in the Indian Ocean, all the way up to Antarctica. For example, the Réunion Island, which is close to the Seychelles, is a French territory, and they have multiple other territories near Antarctica in the southern Indian Ocean as well. And they have a fleet of nuclear submarines that is typically anywhere in the world as an effective second strike option in case somebody messes with them nuclear from the military perspective. So they are a major Indian Ocean power, and they have an independent foreign policy, independent of NATO and the US. And that's where US and France have lots of frictions, right? So today, the main powers are the US and China, obviously, and also India, Russia, and France as well. So we are in a multipolar world. And if you will see, if you follow the events, India and France are cooperating. It's almost like a strategic alliance today between India and France.
Because we are the 2 cornered people.
Because we all seek strategic autonomy from the US. We do not want to fall under the US hegemony completely. So India is buying Rafales from France, the aircraft. We are buying the Scorpion submarines from France. We may have certain other things going on behind the scenes which we may not know about, right? So there's all kinds of things going on. Mr. Modi visits France regularly. Mr. Macron also comes to India from time to time. There is a good relationship brewing there. So that is where India stands today. India is now recognized as one of the major geopolitical powers in the world. If you see the past 4 or 5 months since January, there have been dozens of international visits to India. World leaders, senior diplomats, foreign ministers, finance ministers, and so on. It's a non-stop stream of visits. And Dr. Jaishankar is going all around the world. Mrs. Meenakshi Lekhi, who is the other minister in the foreign ministry, is also going all around the world. And India's diplomats are very active. We are pushing back at the UNSC, UN Security Council, against any BS that's thrown our way. So India is now standing up for itself. And as long as the economy grows, we're going to be fine. Because if your economy grows larger, you have more money for the military as well, and so on.
Speaking about history being cyclic, India has been dominated by invasive forces because of the divide and rule policy primarily. And even today, the nation internally is divided.
Yes.
There is a very strong left-wing versus right-wing narrative that's going on in the nation. Do you think that both the narratives, and I'm not highlighting one single one here, both the narratives and kind of all the negativity on either side is driven through external Chinese forces, through psychological warfare or cyber warfare, or our other rivals? Like, for example, could the left-wing narrative be driven by America for their interests, or China for their interests? And could the right-wing narrative be driven by someone else, say Russia? Is this a possibility?
It is a very good question. So we have this clash going on within India. And the question you have asked is very important. Much of this could possibly be orchestrated from abroad, from outside of India. Because you see certain ideologies which are politically, they don't have much currency in India. Because we see the result of the elections and we see who's winning. And yet these certain political factions seem to be very powerful, and they seem to have unlimited access to funds and all that. So that is a very old trick in the playbook, in the geopolitical playbook. You fund certain political positions in the target country. You prop up certain politicians, or you create new leaders out of nowhere, like Mr. Zelensky, right? And then you use that to divide the country, fragment the country, and possibly bring your sort of person to power, so that you can control the country without actually setting foot there. So it is certainly a possibility. I am not aware personally of who's funding what, or if anybody is funding anyone at all, but it is certainly a very significant possibility.
And it's certainly what the news traditionally will not tell you.
The news will never tell you that.
Because even the news is sort of on one of the two sides. And media generally, you see narratives being drawn by journalists who sometimes draw very anti-right-wing or anti-left-wing narrative. You need to be able to read between the lines. And most importantly, the bottom line here is that the entire nation needs to come together and stop kind of focusing on elements of fear, elements of what can go wrong, and understand that the larger source of fear is on the outside of the borders, where we do have a threat in the form of China. We sort of have an ambiguous threat in the form of USA as well. You said something earlier on in this podcast about how America possibly could have funded the terror attacks that India saw in the 80s and 90s. We know that the terror attacks were funded by Pakistan. Pakistan is not an economic superpower or to be able to have the money to execute such large-scale attacks. They were getting the money from somewhere. At that stage in the 80s and 90s, most of the money...
US.
Yeah. But what was the US's intentions for orchestrating terror attacks in India?
So it's like this. I think it was in 1979 that the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan happened. Now that was an expansion of the sphere of influence of the enemy nation for the US. So what they did was they started this terrorist training program, Mujahideen training program in Pakistan. They provided all unlimited funds to Zia-ul Haq to start these Mujahideen factories, and they also provided unlimited weaponry. And the idea was to wage a proxy war against the USSR in Afghanistan. And that's something that went on for the best part of a decade. Eventually, the USSR was forced to withdraw. So the American strategy worked. Now, once the USSR withdrew, what happened is that Afghanistan came under the Pakistani influence completely. That's firstly. There was this Northern Alliance, there were these coalition governments that were there for some time. But the Pakistanis had created this massive Mujahideen factory, including the Taliban. The Taliban was created during the time of Benazir Bhutto in the 90s. That was the beginning of the Taliban. So once the Afghanistan civil war ended, these Mujahideens, they were like out of work. There was only one work they knew, fighting. So then they were diverted into Kashmir. There is the price the Pakistanis extracted from the US. We did this for you, now you're going to do this for us. So, and even while the Afghanistan conflict was going on, there was this insurgency going on, terrorism going on in Kashmir, across the border. All of that money was being sent by the US. All the money, the training, the arms, ammunition, everything. And once the Afghanistan thing got settled, all of that was poured into Kashmir. There was, I think, 1989 or something, when suddenly there's this explosion of terrorism in Kashmir. So that is when the Kashmiri Hindus, the Kashmiri Pandits were forced out of Kashmir. So that was all, whether we like it or not, there is no other way to say it. It was all funded and financed by the US.
If you read the book Sapiens, you understand how religion can be used to manipulate people on either side. I'm not talking about one religion in particular, but any religion can be used against you. Your religion can be used against you. Because for you, it's a sense of faith, it's a sense of belonging and identity. But anything that you give that much emotional importance to also becomes your point of weakness. And someone can arm twist you and make you do things that you would have not normally done. That's just how the nature of power and the nature of history is. That, especially when it comes to divide and rule policies, people will catch you by the balls and make you do what they want. Like make you their puppet. Hard-hitting question. Could there ever be a Big Daddy India for Pakistan?
When India has sufficient money, even I used to wonder, why doesn't India buy Pakistan out? You buy the generals out, they'll move. The reason why this has never happened is that there are certain people who can always go beyond our offer.
As
in, let's say I offer the Pakistani generals $1 billion. China can double that anytime they want. If I offer 2 billion, they will offer 4 billion. They can. It's like the game in when you are bidding for something, and people are putting up their bids. And then you announce that whoever bids the highest, I'm going to double it. That's it. End of story. So then you buy the item, right? So that sort of thing. The Pakistani generals and dictators are for sale. But India doesn't have the deepest pockets. There is a bigger guy out there. There are two big guys out there, the US and China, who have deeper pockets than India. And that's why the Pakistanis always go towards those two quarters. The moment India becomes bigger than China, let's say hypothetically, that's when we can buy Pakistan out.
We haven't really spoken about Putin much on this particular podcast, and it is, at the end of the day, a Russia-Ukraine themed show, because that one geopolitical event has set off so much else in the world. So how do you look at kind of Putin's angle in this whole war. And I ask you this because I remember the last podcast we did, you had mentioned a line saying that if Russia wants, they can actually take over Ukraine in one shot.
Yes.
But they aren't doing that. So I actually want to know everything about Putin. Because again, as we spoke about early on in the show, it's a few group of men at the top who decide the future of their country and therefore the future of the world in some cases. So let's talk about the man at the top.
So Vladimir Putin came to power about a couple of decades ago. He came to power when his country was in ruins. So after the collapse of the USSR, Boris Yeltsin was in power. And what he did was he put all of the money of the USSR in the hands of a few people, the so-called oligarchs. So the USSR was a collectivized society. Nobody held any private property, but everybody worked and produced resources and the economy. So in effect, the Communist Party was the custodian of the people's money. The wealth they had generated over generations of labor. So all of that wealth was in the custody of the USSR's Communist Party. After the USSR broke up, all of that wealth came into the hands and the control of Mr. Boris Yeltsin. And what he did is he parceled out all of this wealth and all the big industries into the hands of a few oligarchs, of a few people who is his cronies. And then these guys proceeded to destroy those industries. So essentially, one could say that Mr. Yeltsin was an agent of the West. And his task was to liquidate the wealth of the USSR so that Russia would never be a threat again. So after he moved on politically, Mr. Putin was appointed to power. It was hoped, I believe, that he would be another puppet, but he turned out to be something very different. And he set about rebuilding the Russian economy. And the oligarchs are still there. Once something is in place, it stays in place, kind of. And they are too powerful to be displaced, so he worked with them. And he slowly rebuilt the economy. It was stabilized first. The Russians were standing in long queues for bread and soup. That's how it was. So Mr. Putin stabilized the economy. After a decade or so, he started rebuilding the military. And by 2014, he took over Crimea because there was something left over from history. And I'm sure this entire Ukraine thing was planned for a decade or so because it was known what the US was doing, what NATO was doing. It was expanding eastwards relentlessly. So once you come to Ukraine, that's a red line the Russians won't allow. And that's why this entire thing has happened. Now, when it comes to Mr. Putin, he's very secretive. We don't know much about his personal life. He is known to have been married. I think he has 2 daughters. It seems that he was divorced and he has some gymnast girlfriend or whatever. That's not important. That's his personal life. It has nothing to do with us. But now these rumors that you speak about, that he may have blood cancer or some other form of abdominal cancer or something else. Well, there is no evidence for it. It's all coming out from the more or less Western media. We don't really know what's happening. I mean, I'm personally not aware of whether he's sick or he's well, or whether it's all strategic ambiguity, like they say. We don't quite know. In case he is not well, then he would possibly, conceivably have planned for his succession, that after me, who comes in? Because if he moves on, if he passes away and a weak leader comes to power, then his 20 years of work will be wasted. So there will be some kind of succession plan in place, which we don't know about. In the Chinese Communist Party, there's a very clear method of succession. You have to come to the top 5 in the party, the Politburo, the Central Committee, and from those guys, one guy is chosen. That's how it is. And it's usually 5 years, but now Mr. Xi Jinping has extended it beyond 5 years. Now, in the case of Mr. Putin, there is no such mechanism that we are aware of. So I'm not sure what the succession plan is. I think he's already crossed 70 years of age. So I'm sure he must have thought about it. But we don't quite know. And maybe it is by design that we don't know, because you should never let the world know what you're planning.
And I don't feel you can trust mainstream media when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine situation, which is why I ask you, sir, as a geopolitical expert, what's happening on ground today? And what do you think Putin is making of it?
So I try to source my information from various small outlets like Twitter accounts and Telegram accounts and all, in addition to the mainstream picture, so that I get 2 sides of the perspective. Because in mainstream social media, you don't get the Russian perspective. You only get the Ukrainian and US perspective. So what appears to be happening right now is that the Russians are consolidating their hold on the territories they have captured. And they are inching forward and trying to denazify those regions. So the Azov regiment and all, they are being made to surrender or being wiped out. That's what's happening. They are creating this cauldrons, which is encircling the enemy and then wiping them out from inside, asking them to surrender. If they don't surrender, you know what happens. So that sort of thing. So they have not used the Air Force much. They have a massive Air Force. The Russians have hardly used their Air Force. And they have a massively powerful military. But they have been very restrained in their use of power. So it is clear by now that they had limited objectives. They did not want to take over the whole of Ukraine or even half of Ukraine. They only wanted to take over the parts of Ukraine which are Russian-speaking, Russian majority. So that seems to be something they are close to accomplishing. Obviously, the situation is still contested, and the Americans are pouring in weaponry and supplies into Ukraine so that the Ukrainians can keep on fighting. So it looks like this conflict will drag on. The Russians don't want to overwhelm the whole country. It's not something they want to they don't want to overextend their army. So it looks like this conflict will remain a low intensity conflict, like an insurgency for the foreseeable future. And the Americans will fight till the last Ukrainian is alive. That's what it looks like.
And obviously my next question is, when will that big throw come, according to you? That when is shit gonna break through? Is it going to be when China invades Taiwan properly, or India?
It could be a number of scenarios. I think the Russia-Ukraine situation seems to be stabilizing. It is foolhardy to make predictions there, but it seems to be the way it is, and it may stay that way. If something happens, it could happen most likely in the Indo-Pacific, either India-China or China-Taiwan. These are the two most likely spots where trouble could erupt. If it is India-China, it will happen before 2024. So we could be we could be in for something in the coming months, possibly, if it is to happen. Otherwise, it is Taiwan, which could happen anytime this decade. The Chinese will make a move on Taiwan when they perceive that the time is right. Or if they start panicking that we are no longer progressing the way we want to progress, and let's grab what we can before we become too weak. So these are the two main possibilities, the most likely possibilities if something happens. I hope no war ever happens. I would like peace. But yeah, it's either China-India or China-Taiwan. The Russia-Ukraine thing seems to be stabilizing. Will a throw come from Putin's side? We don't know.
Do you have any final kind of cues for the audience?
What I would say is that this decade, the 2020s, is going to be most likely the decade of vast geopolitical change. Typically, you see geopolitical change decade upon decade. If you go year upon year, you don't see much happening. But in this decade, you're going to see changes happen that typically take several decades to happen. And it's already in motion. So there could be a hot war this decade, maybe in the coming years. But the entire global chessboard is going to be realigned by 2030. That is for sure. Political borders, national boundaries may change by 2030. So we need to be prepared mentally for this, and we need to be resilient as a nation.
Abhijit Chavda, so thank you once again. Brilliant episode. And I hope you had fun.
Thank you so much. Great.